Thank you very much and welcome back. So for our second session focusing on space deterrence and integrated deterrence, I am very pleased to say we're going to be looking even higher towards the stars. And what better way to start this session than to welcome the 4-star Commander of Space Operations in the United States of America, General Chance Saltzman. Welcome.
Wow, this is a distinguished group again. I enjoyed last year so much I thought I'd come back when the weather was better, so thanks for all of that. Thanks, Susanna, for that kind introduction. Thanks to everyone here at GASCC that helped makes this important conversation possible. And it's going to be my honor later to share the stage with Generals Novak and Tedman. So thanks for indulging me with your patience while I try to set the stage for this important conversation. And to my fellow Air and Space Chiefs, as well as the academic and industry leaders gathered here today, thank you for being here, and I look forward to sharing ideas on deterrence with you. Now, when I was a young officer, I could not understand deterrence. But now, after many years of education, experience, and intense mentoring, I can assure you I am no longer a young officer. So let me apologize in advance to the non-history buffs in the room as I'm going to dive into the history of deterrence in an attempt to contextualize the challenges we are currently facing and applying them to the concept of space. So hang in there. I think it's going to help us chart a way forward. Let me start with the earliest discussions of deterrence as a concept. And by early, I mean 2,500 years ago, to that famous Athenian general and historian Thucydides. I know, I said bear with me, right? I get to say anything I want now. All right, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides describes no less than 10 uses of what he called a deterrence strategy. And that was the conflict between Athens and Sparta. And aside from one partial exception, they all failed spectacularly. In fact, in most cases, they primarily served to provoke the exact behavior they were meant to prevent. Yet here we are today at a panel called Space Deterrence and Integrated Deterrence. What I intend to do is attempt to address two fundamental questions. First, is deterrence a suitable military construct to help us deliver forces needed to meet security objectives, particularly in space? And second, are there limits to what can be deterred? Historically speaking, deterrence has rarely been a major element of military strategy until the modern era. But now our strategies are riddled with terms like nuclear deterrence, strategic deterrence, conventional deterrence, minimum deterrence, extended deterrence, and as we see here today, space and integrated deterrence. And presumably, each of these serves different strategic objectives. So what's changed? Well, in short, I contend what has changed is nuclear weapons. The root of what we understand today as deterrence grew from the decisive application of nuclear weapons in World War II. In 1959, Bernard Brodie, one of the foremost civilian military strategists of his era, published Strategy in the Missile Age. And this seminal book, now 65 years old, became the foundational text for deterrence as a modern strategy. In its pages, Brodie encouraged military leaders to think about the unthinkable, to confront the threat of nuclear war, and to carefully consider the realities of deterrence in the dawning of the nuclear age. Deterrence, he wrote, now means something as a strategic policy only when we are fairly confident that the retaliatory instrument upon which it relies will not be called upon to function at all. In short, we expect the system to be always ready to spring while going permanently unused. And Brodie's work drove the reemergence of the term and popularized deterrence in the modern context. The word itself is an appropriate one, derived from the Latin for terrible or terrifying, signifying that to deter is to frighten away. But the deterrence of Brodie had little in common with the deterrence of Thucydides. As Brodie wrote, what was distinctively new about deterrence in the atomic age was the degree to which it was intolerable should it fail. Deterrence in his mind was a threshold condition. On one side, a state of stability. On the other side, a state of intolerable devastation. So to the first question, is this a suitable construct for us to use? Over the course of my career, I've come to the conclusion that deterrence is really is a term of policy best used to capture an ideal outcome of grand strategy. This is why I believe integrated deterrence is a valuable and worthy approach in the U.S.'s national defense strategy. Our NDS describes it as a weaving together of capabilities and concepts with those of our international and interagency partners to dissuade aggression. In other words, a whole of government and an international approach as a grand strategy in pursuit of an ideal set of security outcomes. But with that said, we should recognize that militaries only play a supporting role in this strategy, and we must provide the proper support if we're to achieve the desired outcome. As Air and Space Chiefs, we owe it to our national decision makers to focus on creating operational realities that can help derive this desired outcome. For those of us in uniform, our goal must be to assist in deterrence by taking actions that are far more tangible. We must remember that deterrence lives in the mind of an adversary, and therefore figuring out which forces are needed to affect a mental calculus can be and is subjective and problematic. Therefore, I contend that we shouldn't think about building forces to deter. We should build forces to attack and defend. And if we do this properly, it will help our national leaders create the conditions of deterrence. And for those of you thinking that this is a difference without a distinction, I'm asking you to consider the science of our profession, not the art of its employment. Consider this. Imagine being asked to deter a missile attack. Soon, the mind begins to boggle with all of the pros and cons of conducting the attack, factors that might enhance the penalties, downplay the benefits. How best to alter another decision calculus when we have probably limited insights into the motivations, constraints, and restraints? This is problematic. Now consider being asked to defend against a missile attack. The questions that come to mind are more quantifiable. How many missiles? On what trajectory? Altitude? Speed? What's their target? Can we use technology to intercept the missile in flight? Can I harden or hide the target to negate the missile's effect? The science of this operational challenge is knowable, definable, and it's not as difficult to conceive of activities to accomplish this mission. The art of influencing the adversary to not take the action to begin with is much harder to quantify and translate into mission-oriented activities, and even in so doing, it is infinitely dynamic in time and place, mostly guesswork, and therefore unsuited to effectively determine our force designs. Again, this is not a repudiation of deterrence as a policy or even a grand strategy. Quite the contrary. I think it is the most desirable end state for any national security apparatus. But we must do our part. As Air and Space Service Chiefs, we must focus on the military specifics of that national security apparatus. In other words, we must organize, train, and equip forces that can provide offensive and defensive capabilities and capacities that punish aggressors and protect and defend our national interests. In designing these capabilities, we must focus on the D verbs of military action: deny, degrade, disrupt, and destroy, and avoid deter as an action for military forces due to its inherent ambiguities. If we do this right, the net result is a condition of deterrence that maintains a safe, secure, and stable international environment, which is the ultimate goal of our national security policy. To summarize the answer to the first question, I'll say that deterrence is well suited to grand strategy, or as a policy end, but less suitable as a construct to help militaries effectively organize, train, and equip. Now let's turn to the second question. Are there limits to what can be deterred? To start, remember what I said about Brody's view of deterrence. In his view, only when the most severe consequences are assured and well understood can we truly achieve deterrence. Strategic nuclear weapons are therefore a singular example because all else pales into insignificance in the face of annihilation. That same level of certainty simply does not exist for other sets of military conditions. Another key consideration in determining what can be deterred is noting that we have an intrinsic understanding that rational actors will not respond disproportionately to a non-nuclear attack. Would a cyber attack or a downing of an RPA drive a nuclear response? Hasn't yet. I think it's highly unlikely to in the future. This is the essence of deterrence theory, nuclear attacks being reserved for only existential interests, and with assurance of nuclear counterstrike, a state of nuclear deterrence exists between nuclear powers. The problem is that strategic stability that this creates makes it an attractive logic to apply elsewhere. Since 1945, we've experienced cycle after cycle of escalation and de-escalation. Time and again, when factored, nuclear weapons have served as a tool of political exchange. And no matter how close we've come to the brink, they have not been used again. This evolution has conditioned us to normalize and even extend nuclear deterrence logic beyond its practical limits. We have allowed deterrence as a concept to morph from a very specific existential edge case into a caricature, an overly simplistic logical reduction of the theory. Today, all too often, there is a view in military circles that deterrence is a cost-benefit calculus that can be manipulated to preclude or dictate an adversary's actions. In short, we've led ourselves to conclude and believe that we can use military logic of nuclear deterrence to be more broadly applied. Bit by bit, we have subconsciously absorbed the notion that if done right, we can use military force to deter all sorts of actions that run counter to our national interests. But in practice, as we have seen, there are limits to deterrence. So in determining where these limits are, perhaps, it's necessary to first describe the characteristics of effective deterrence. I would propose that there are three broad characteristics. First, there must exist credible capabilities to conduct activities that deny benefits and impose costs. Second, these capabilities must be observable in order to establish sufficient credibility. And finally, the consequences of action must be unambiguous, unacceptable, and clearly put the aggressor at a disadvantage. The difficulties created by the subjectivity of ambiguity, acceptability, and clarity brings us right back to Thucydides. In his histories, Thucydides observed that nations go to war for three fundamental reasons: fear, honor, and interest, which is a useful insight, but does little to help us predict the future, because the manifestation of these and the pressures, influence, and intensity that they bring are extremely sensitive to circumstance and very dynamic in their interaction. When honor is at stake, national leaders may accept unanticipated amounts of risk, and they may actually welcome threats to enable them to demonstrate courage. Honor is incredibly cultural. It is never easy to guarantee the forms that honor might take or the lengths to which an actor will take to secure it. When fear is the prime motivator, assessments of consequence become skewed. Leaders can rationalize that compliance or appeasement is far more costly than resistance, even if that does not seem to be the case from an external or third-party viewpoint. But of the three, interest is by far the hardest to measure effectively. Even if one nation can understand the interests of another, there is very little chance that it will value them in the same way. If we struggle enough to understand our own underlying motivations, do we believe that we can accurately calculate the resources an adversary will commit to secure a benefit? More to the point, would we value denying that benefit so much so that we would commit the same level of resources? What Thucydides unknowingly instructs us on is that fear, honor, and interest are inherently tough to assess because of extreme subjectivity in the concepts of ambiguity, acceptability, and clarity. The third defining characteristic of effective deterrence eludes us. Trying to guess or interpret how an adversary may act, therefore, can muddy military decision-making and create room for speculation and error. All too often, rigorous assessment can give way to wishful thinking. So nuclear weapons are the exception rather than the rule because they eliminate all ambiguity and replace it with a cold certainty. Fear of assured and devastating destruction trumps all else. And that's why nuclear deterrence, and only nuclear deterrence, has a record of spectacular success. To summarize the answer to the second question, nuclear attacks can be deterred by a nuclear-armed nation. However, because of the challenge of meeting this third characteristic of deterrence, unambiguity, unacceptability, and the clear disadvantage to an aggressor, extending deterrence to other military circumstances has serious limitations. Again, I want to emphasize, and I only mean limitations in the sense of being a guiding light for organizing, training, and equipping military forces. Deterrence in grand strategy and describing ideal national security end states is valuable and worthwhile. In contrast, the extension of the logic from nuclear to non-nuclear deterrence is suspect from a military perspective, particularly when you try to imagine what deterrence in space might look like. So now that I've laid out the broader point in excruciating detail, let's narrow the focus to the space domain. Here the key question is, can we deter an attack on space assets? I hope after that extended preamble, you understand why I say a better question for military leaders is how do we defend against an attack on space assets? Or a broader question, how do we protect our interests in, from, and to space? And when I was a young space operator, the space domain was largely benign. So we focused on assured access with launch and ground networks and optimizing space missions that supported other forces, like with communication, precision navigation and timing, ISR. But now, threats to these capabilities have been fielded, and we recognize now that we will have to contest the space domain in order to use it effectively. And this relatively new mission of space superiority will mirror air superiority as it seeks to protect our capabilities and deny the adversary the use of theirs. In the U.S. Space Force, to accomplish the mission of space superiority, we have proposed a theory of success called competitive endurance. This theory includes three key tenets: avoiding operational surprise, denying first mover advantage, and conducting responsible counter-space activities. And this theory is key because these key tenets guide us in all the supporting decisions that must be made. For example, what systems do we need to disrupt or deny an adversary's space-based targeting? What training do our operators need to counter adversary tactics? How do we enhance mission resiliency in a cost-effective way? How do we fuse data on an operationally relevant timeline to avoid surprise? In short, the tenets help us organize, train, and equip to perform specific military activities rather than pursue a more esoteric concept like deterrence. The success of competitive endurance comes when our forces can anticipate aggression, protect our space missions, deny, degrade, disrupt an adversary's space capabilities. Now, obviously, we believe if we do these things effectively, we will contribute to the broader efforts to maintain an effective state of deterrence. But rather than organizing, training, and equipping to deter, we do it to accomplish specific military missions. The U.S. Space Force's approach acknowledges that we cannot be expected to deter all disagreeable, concerning, or aggressive behaviors. But we will be able to react and respond in a manner that preserves a stable security environment, discouraging more drastic behaviors. And this back and forth constitutes great power competition. And maintaining a state of competition with adversarial nations is far more preferable to crisis or conflict. And competitive endurance strives to promote stability. Now back to the history. In his study of major wars that shaped international order up to World War II, military strategist Captain B.H. Littlehart found that only 2% of battles were won as a result of a direct attack, and even then at great cost. Indirect attacks, misdirection, and what he called the power of endurance to last, all far more effective in successful campaigns against a near-peer adversary. That power of endurance to last is very much at the heart of competitive endurance, and it is enhanced and sustained by an interconnected web of capabilities designed to protect and defend. It is for this reason, precisely, that we value our alliances and partnerships so dearly. Only by working together can we truly achieve the endurance required to implement competitive endurance over the long years ahead. Fortunately, our allies and partners remain an unparalleled source of enduring strength and competitive advantage, particularly in the domain of space. And this is not just a good idea, it's part of U.S. policy. Our classified space security guidance issued in June of 2023 directs the U.S. to increase integration with allies and partners on space activities, operations, plans, capabilities, and information sharing for mutual benefit in response to growing space and counterspace threats and to protect U.S. forces from hostile uses of space. The United States is proud to be a part of an ever-growing group of allies and partners, many of them in the room today. A group of partners that are all working together to increase resiliency, redundancy, and interoperability of all space-based capabilities to enhance our collective security. Along these lines, we endeavor to lead efforts in the responsible, peaceful, and sustainable uses of space. And this includes promoting international norms of responsible behavior. Let me give you some examples of what I'm describing. In 2023, we conducted the first bilateral space cooperation dialogue with the Indian Ministry of Defense. We advanced discussions with our Japanese partners on finalizing our unique space domain awareness hosted payload partnership. Collaboration between the U.S. and Norway enabled the integration of U.S. payloads onto 2 Norwegian satellites to provide 24/7 protected satellite communications for forces operating in the Arctic. Another good example is Operation Olympic Defender, which improves mission assurance and enhances collective resilience alongside Australian, British, Canadian allies. And in April, U.S. Space Command formally invited France, Germany, and New Zealand to participate in Olympic Defender, moving forward. And exercises like Global Sentinel bring together multinational partners into single venue to wrestle with and resolve space security issues. These efforts have been extraordinarily successful in expanding key partnerships by demonstrating and strengthening a multinational concept of operations. Each of our nations has its own respective capabilities in the space domain, its own strengths to share, whether that be in SATCOM, space domain awareness, launch, whatever else. By unifying and aligning that strength towards robust protect and defend activities, we can capitalize on our capabilities to enable deterrence. It is a matter of finding our form and giving it proper function. Unity of effort for collective defense that ensures a sustained and long-term advantage over anyone who might care to threaten it. So to summarize this long, drawn-out history class today, we touched on Thucydides and his doomed retelling of classical deterrence, Brody and his modern recontextualization of nuclear deterrence, and how these influenced our development of competitive endurance. And finally, I discussed a collective need to focus on specific, tangible military capabilities and activities that allow us to protect and defend and ultimately secure our interests in, from, and to space. In the end, what I'm advocating for here is a change in focus and clarification of thought. Deterrence is the rightful and worthy province of our civilian and political leaders, and we must stand ready to support it. To do that effectively, I propose we design our forces and orchestrate our activities around military functions like protect and defend, which can more tangibly pursue rather than deterrence, which is more nebulous and complex concept. There are a number of areas where we are and where we can work together towards that goal. Areas like coordinated investments in visible defensive capabilities, tactics, and doctrine. Areas like mutual space domain awareness and data sharing. Areas like alliance building and defining and adhering to responsible behaviors in space. Together, we must foster an environment conducive to civil and commercial space activities. Together, we must find innovative ways to protect our space systems from attack and protect allied forces from space-enabled attack, targeting, and tracking. Together, we must delegitimize space activities that exacerbate the growth of orbital debris or put our space assets and the lives of our astronauts at risk. Now, these are no small tasks, but the world is watching, both our friends and our adversaries, to judge how we collectively respond to challenges in these historic times. Looking around this room, I firmly believe we are up to this challenge. Thank you again for including me and allowing me to dive back in history. Thanks for inviting me here today, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Semper Supra. Thank you.
General Saltzman, please, thank you very much, and do join us for this discussion, because I'm pleased to say the General's going to be answering some questions, but also please do give a warm welcome to the General's fellow Space Chiefs, Major General Greg Novak from Australia and Major General Paul Tedman from the United Kingdom. Welcome.
Greg Novak, lovely to meet you.
Hi, thank you very much. So first of all, Greg Novak, could I just get you to just give a bit of a response to what you heard from General Saltzman, and I suppose particularly focusing on whether we should be focusing on this concept of deterrence, or whether actually the focus should be on defence and attack, and whether it kind of muddies the water a little bit.
All right, so you're stitching up the Army guy first by asking me to comment on the 4 stars presentation. Fantastic. Well, maybe I'll just start. Sir, thanks very much for setting the scene as you have. What a great primer, and I think we're set for a great discussion over the next few minutes. And I guess as well for my UK hosts here and for all the heavy lifters behind the scenes of this forum, thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to such an important discussion. It's wonderful to be here among so many like-mindeds and professionals from defence organisations, industry, academia, all with shared interests in the space domain. I guess from an Australian perspective, I'd offer first up that we have our National Defence Strategy released in April of 24. That recognises, no surprises to this audience, the increasing strategic competition that we're facing across the world at the moment. And it centres on a strategy of denial as our primary response, and within that denial, aiming to deter escalation to conflict. Now, as Australia's Space Commander, and having been in the chair now for about 7 months, what I'd like to do, I guess, in response is just offer 3 points that I think build on the narrative we've just heard from General Saltzman, how I think what I do in Australia's Space Commander within the space domain contributes to that integrated deterrence, and hopefully that also prompts some discussion in the Q&A that follows. So the first one that I think is a key one for everything that I do is that in Australian context, and I know it's shared with many of the allies and partners in the room, space is a domain in its own right. That's beyond question. I don't like the term anymore, certainly in an Australian context, of space as an enabler. I don't think that accurately describes what we do. We are part of our focused and fully integrated force. No two ways about that. And we have to operate as a peer of the other domains, maritime, air, land, and cyber. That requires an approach that sees us not bolted on to a campaign plan or an operation. Requires an approach that doesn't see us coming into the process late. We are in from force design to concept development, campaign design, force generation, op planning, execution, right up to operational assessment. We have to be present and credible in that domain if we want to deliver some of the effects that were just so eloquently explained. And the capabilities and systems that we rely upon to provide that presence, they have got to be resilient, they've got to be survivable. Now that's something that a number of the panels have already touched on today. I know Paul and I have discussed as well, and he's going to talk to that point as well. So I won't labour the point, but happy to offer further views on resilience in our space architecture from an Australian context in questions if that's an area of interest you'd like to go to. The last point I'd raise is not truer for any other domain than space. You can't succeed on your own. And I think our standing and status as a trusted, valued and contributing partner is key to what we do as well. Australia has wonderful geography for space operations, and I think we all know that. And I'll stomp the floor at that every chance I get. But it's not just geography that we bring. Granted, our scale is less than a lot of the allies and partners represented in the room here today. That's nothing we step back from either. But we have established connectivity. We have system commonality. We have interoperability with the systems that aren't common. But I think most importantly, we've got a highly trained, really talented and trusted workforce that contributes to the space mission every day for Australia's interests and also those of our allies and partners. So they're the 3 points I'd offer in response, and hopefully to prompt some discussion. I know there's going to be a lot of questions. I don't want to hog the mic anymore, so I'll leave my prepared remarks there, but thanks once again for the chance to contribute.
Many thanks. Thank you. And now let me hand the baton over to Major General Paul Tedman for your initial thoughts on this subject.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and particularly to see so many friends that I've come to know over the years. It's always really difficult, isn't it, for me to be third of three and to follow the tour de force of CSO and the excellent brief from Greg, my battle buddy here. And I should also say, although he's been in the job 7 months, I've had a month in the chair. So one of my old bosses would say, you're firmly on Mount Stupid, Tedman. So I'll do my very best to get after some of the questions this afternoon. The guiding light, I guess, for UK Space Command has been the Defence Space Strategy that was published in February 22. And it's a brilliant document and held up as an exemplar across government as a strategy that's actually working. It gives me intent, it provides me some governance, I've got some capability requirements and some money, which is always nice, in the guise of something called a defence space portfolio. But as we've heard from literally everybody today and reinforced by my colleagues here, the world has not stood still since 2022. And we're seeing, dare I say it, increasing and diversifying threats on orbit, which I think Nicola covered really well earlier in the panel. And set against those threats, we're also seeing our dependence increase. And I mean that economically, where I think there was a recent report published in the UK that said if we lost a timing signal or it was at least disrupted, that would cost the UK economy £1 billion a day. And dare I say it, we all use about 40 satellites a day just to go about our normal business. So there's an economic dependency that's deepening. And of course, there's a military dependence that we're seeing deepen, which we've talked about a lot today. And I'd argue that space capabilities underpin deterrence across the entire force. A bit closer to home for UK Space Command then, I think since we stood up in 2021, we've increased our space IQ, and we're working very hard to increase Defence's IQ on space, and hence why it's so great to see so many of you here. We've also learned lots of lessons about space, particularly from Ukraine, and again, we heard that earlier, and dare I say it, the importance of allies and partners, and how important space is to modern multi-domain operations. We've also deepened relationships, and General Saltzman mentioned this. We've worked really hard on the Combined Space Operations Initiative. Operation Olympic Defender, our standing operation, is also growing, we hope, and Global Sentinel and other organisational exercises like the Shriva War Games are helping us, again, understand space better. So what does that look like in the future? Well, I think we need to constantly evolve, and I guess that's my point about we've moved on from when the strategy was published, and we need to evolve in order to compete. And I'd just offer 3 areas to get after General Saltzman's points about areas we might like to discuss and focus on as we build capability, so not necessarily the why, but the what in order to do that. The first would be resilience. I think resilience is the primary means to mitigate adversary space capabilities and assure our own space capabilities. So we need resilient by design architectures going forward. By that I mean proliferated, disaggregated, distributed, protected and defended architectures across all segments, the ground, link and the space segment. So resilience absolutely fundamental to the capabilities we should be delivering going forward. The second thing I think we should think about is that resilience will not be enough, as General Saltzman said. And the ability to secure space control, I think, is going to be important. There's 2 aspects to that. It's having really good domain awareness, and as General Saltzman said, the ability to deny, degrade, disrupt, and defeat adversary capabilities. And then finally, to the third point I'd just like to offer before we get to questions, and it's an obvious one. It's just that space is a team sport. The transnational nature of the domain, the fact that it's now increasingly contested and congested, means that we have to collaborate with like-minded nations. It's just essential to deterrence in space going forward. And dare I say it, it's that collaboration that separates us from our adversaries and defines us. Space is just too vast and too expensive to go it alone, and therefore increasingly I think a joint, combined and increasingly partnered approach with industry is required to deter and, if necessary, fight and win the battle above. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Major General. Okay, so I want to kick off this session, this Q&A session, with one of the questions that came through earlier and we didn't have time to pose in the first session, and I thought that it was very relevant. So We've referred to space capability as eyes and ears, and we do so frequently. But is the weaponization of space inevitable? Can I ask you first, General?
Sure, you can ask. It's a great question. I get it all the time. I come back to a couple of basic principles. First, there was a time when space was benign, and we only had to focus on the access to space, getting that right, and then delivering the kinds of capabilities that you're talking about to enhance global economies as well as military capabilities. Unfortunately, there are competitor nations, adversaries out there that have spent tremendous amount of money operationalizing systems designed to negate those advantages. And we have to be able to respond in order to protect those capabilities. I believe that is the new core function of military service in the US and in these joint commands in other countries, and that's to control space so that we can continue to exploit it the way we need to. I think that is first and foremost, and we can't ignore that set of responsibilities. When we say weaponization of space, it's a little bit of a charged phrase, and I know why we say it, I know why we use it. I'd love to be back in those conditions of benign environment, but I talk all the time about, an F-35, is that an offensive or defensive weapon? It's both. It's neither. It's a system that allows us to conduct military operations at the behest of the leadership team. And we owe it to build a spectrum of capabilities to maximize the decision space that these national leaders have in protecting their interests in all domains. And so we are pursuing those systems in order to make sure that we can provide a spectrum of operations to protect our interests. Whether that becomes weaponization, it becomes a little bit of a semantical argument rather than a military operation to protect our interests.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to come in here? I was going to ask Paul Tedman, well, you were nodding, and I just wanted to just to see if you could expand on the fact that you said, it's very important that we have resilience by design to protect and defend. But what General Saltzman's really focusing on is, and you've alluded to that, this teamwork. You've got to work as a team. So is the strategy going forward going to be, okay, we've got resilience by design, but now we may need to make sure we've got defense, but also domination of space?
Yeah, so I guess I would add that, like all domains, you start with a concept. How will we fight on orbit, and how will we enable the joint force? And I think that's becoming far more mature now in terms of how we would do that. From those concepts, you then get into conversations about the capabilities that you need to do that. And I would describe them as, if we were going to enable the joint force, the first thing we need to be able to do is to globally sense. The second thing we need to be able to do is enable that decision advantage through satellite communications and data links, and also enable long-range precision strike. So they are enabling the joint force type capabilities. The third thing that I think is at the thrust of the question is that we also need to protect and defend to enable the control we would need to deliver those capabilities to the joint force. So to do that, we need to be able to shield our own forces from adversary space capabilities, but also assure our own national interests in space and the delivery of effect to the joint force. So to do that, and you saw my sort of almost triangle, or you heard of it earlier, yes, there's a sovereign approach to that. There's clearly an allied approach to that because we can't do it on our own. And again, there's a partnered approach to that with commercial too. And I think commercially, we're going to do far more in space to deliver effects than perhaps we do in other domains as we move into the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, another question. Lots of questions are coming through. This one from Sarah Skinner from Babcock. Could the space domain become the Wild West? How do we coordinate and ensure a degree of standardization to create the best effect and deterrence in the domain? And what is the industry's role to develop the concept of operations? Do you want to take that one?
I think Australia's views towards space, and I think there's great alignment with our allies and partners here, is General mentioned it before, access, security, stability. One of them is also encouraging responsible behaviour in space, encouraging and concatenating global norms that mean that access, security and stability is sustainable. How do we make sure that we don't move into the Wild West? Well, part of that is that deterrence piece we've spoken about already. Part of it is making sure that when we present the case for not having the Wild West, it's not just one nation speaking. Okay, it's a collection of as many like-minded as we can find who are ready and willing to call out irresponsible behaviour and to use the full levers of their national apparatus to apply some consequences for those that don't want to adhere to that. And I think there's also a narrative there and a messaging piece which is important, not just within military and government, to our wider communities, of just how important the space domain is to our everyday way of life, and explaining to them the impact of a Wild West type scenario is not something we can really contemplate. It's in no one's interest. So that comes back full circle now to that access, security, stability, responsible behaviours and applicable global norms.
Okay, many thanks. So a question come through from Christian Gleave. Noting that situational awareness has been cited as fundamental to our collective success in space, does the panel accept that as the domain proliferates, the role for industrial partners in deterrence is becoming critically important? I mean, I know you don't like focusing on deterrence, but let's substitute that for defence. What's your take on that?
It shouldn't be lost on any of us that when you look at the space domain, it's hard to separate the ideas and the concepts of combat versus non-combat. I say this frequently when you look at a combat zone or an area where conflict has broken out, the first thing that happens is you try to get out of that area. Whether you're internally displaced people, whether you're commercial entities, you can look at the air picture over Ukraine and see the flight patterns around that airspace. The problem is in space that becomes very problematic. The orbital mechanics, the laws of orbits tell us that you're going to be in those positions and we can't easily separate it. So to the question of is industry going to be involved in this? Absolutely. Academia is going to be involved. Civil space is going to be involved. You're inextricably linked to the orbital mechanics of space and you will be inherently a part of it, which is why the operational concepts that these gentlemen are talking about have to account for that, because we have to see that we're going to need to be able to have exquisite understanding of what's going on in the domain so that we can attribute bad behavior, so that we can hold people accountable for their actions and protect all of the assets that ultimately need to be protected.
But how do allies and partners share vital space information, given that the domain, of course, has many classification challenges as well?
I'll come to that, but maybe some context first is, and we talked about those concepts, and we have a domain concept which is reasonably fresh, but the first thing I think is you know your terrain. Okay, it's just like any other domain. It's got geography, it's got key terrain, it's got weather, it's got obstacles, it's got friendly forces, own forces, threat forces. The list goes on. It's just like the land domain from my context. So understanding that domain and keeping a constant awareness of what's happening in that domain is fundamental to the other steps of your concept. You don't have that, everything else becomes harder as a minimum. And I think when we talk about space domain awareness specifically, it's always going to be an element of sovereign. You're always going to have some of your own sovereign capability, that minimum viable capability that's yours. But increasingly, you're going to do that in cooperation with your allies and partners, and you're going to leverage off each other's systems. There's going to be, we're already seeing now, an increase in dual use, so there might be a commercial system that's got military functionality or payloads. There might be a cause to draw off specific commercial systems and buy their data, buy their pictures or engage their services, because we're trying to get multi-spectrum, multi-locations around the globe, persistent coverage of all of these things. And then the sharing piece can be made easier because you've got those tiers. You might have the highest level of classification sitting over your sovereign capabilities. Okay, we're all going to have that. Allied and combined capabilities with those trusted partners that we've worked with and have established relationships and information exchange relationships, all right, that's the next tier. And then we might get right down to non-classified material that's commercially provided. When you layer all those things on top of each other and note that they will change in weighting and rate of effort depending on what's happening, then I think that's one of the ways you can achieve that info exchange that is so critical to what we do.
Okay, thank you. Paul Tedman?
So space is a global commons and we need to all protect it, I think, is my start point for this. And we're doing lots of work on norms of responsible behaviour into the United Nations, where all of the countries represented here, and I know many in the audience too. And it's not that sharing of information and what's happening on domain. It isn't necessarily just a military responsibility. That's a cross-government responsibility as we've heard, there's 40,000 objects up there. I'll say the size of a cricket ball, but I think General Saltzman would say a baseball. And we need to track those exquisitely on a daily basis, hourly basis, and dare I say it, every minute. In the UK, for example, we're standing up something called the National Space Operations Centre, which I'm working with my colleagues in the UK Space Agency. So they're doing the space traffic management aspects of domain awareness, and I'm conducting the military aspects. So working together, cross-government, is one of the solutions to this. In terms of sharing information, I think we're doing pretty well on this. SpaceTrack.org's out there for commercial providers anyway. There's hundreds of subscribers to SpaceTrack.org, which, for those of you who don't know, is just a software tool that you log onto, which will give you an awareness of what's happening up on orbit. There's something called the Joint Commercial Operations, which General Saltzman owns, which again is a data lake, and it's not even unclassified, it's non-classified data that anyone can access to, and it is just hung on a cloud with various different levels of classification. And we routinely all work together with something in the framework called Space Situational Awareness Sharing Agreements, where we all share what's going on domain for the benefit of all of us.
And I think that's an important piece that Tedder brings up. For flight safety, for safety of flight information, it's widely available. That's not information that we're classifying, right, because safety of flight is, we communicate with the PRC, we communicate with anybody who has satellites that could be in conjunction with one another. We provide that data without classification.
Would bring in another question as well. This is from Ethan. Does the reliance on satellites and SATCOM pose a significant risk to future operations where jamming and interception of information is becoming more common? And if so, can we move away from this reliance so we can still maintain some connectivity?
I think this is the sort of intersection we have. You've got this environment which we all acknowledge and all experience every day is getting more contested and congested with more threat capabilities out there. But at the same time, our forces, our integrated forces, are becoming increasingly reliant on those space-based capabilities. So that's the challenge. I mean, in a previous life, I had an appointment where I was responsible for Australia's global defence network from our deployed forces and between our bases and defence establishments. I'm sure it's not unique to Australia. You try very hard to remove single points of failure. You're going to incorporate terrestrial, you're going to incorporate HF, you're going to look for novel means to disperse your SATCOM capabilities across frequencies, waveforms, orbits, constellations. Okay, you're going to build that resilience piece that we've all spoken about already several times. But that's a long answer to a short question. Yes, it is vulnerable, but we don't just sit on our hands and accept that. Okay, we plan around it. We design ConOps. And we then execute those operations to mitigate those risks as best we can.
And just following up on this point, in many ways, General Tedman suggested commercial capability might deliver space effects. Does not lessons from Ukraine, such as Starlink, suggest that this may not be credible?
Well, it depends what lessons you draw from the use of Starlink. I think in Ukraine is how I would categorise it. I mean, I think it's fair to say that some of the first shots we saw fired in the conflict in Ukraine, occurred in space or quickly transitioned to space, and therefore they weren't necessarily military targets that had effects placed on them, and so we saw an impact onto commercial providers in that domain. So, in terms of did we learn the right lessons from the use of space in Ukraine? Well, I think we're still learning. It would be a little bit trite to draw the lessons now and draw a line under it and say that's what we learned about it. But what is clear is that the command and control, that decision advantage that I talked about earlier, was delivered to Ukraine through space-based systems, and that became really, really important, and it was enabled ultimately by a commercial provider and still is.
I think it's important to recognize that we are to a point in integration where the idea that why don't we just not rely on the things that are integrated now and maybe we'll be safer, I think that's probably not the right logic going forward. So if you say satellite communications is vulnerable, why don't we communicate in other ways? Well, because actually satellite communications is so interwoven into all forms of communication, whether it's terrestrial or otherwise, just saying, why don't we not have space and we'll be safer is not, it's a fallacy. It is so integrated, it's so baked in. Not relying on commercial services is no longer an option for the current military complex. We are so integrated and so reliant on services. Where are we going to get aviation fuel without commercial providers? Where are we going to get any number of the services that ultimately we count on commercial industry to provide to us. It's about solid contracting, it's about planning, it's about expectation management, and it's perfectly reasonable to assume that we will have those capabilities we need it, provided we've done all the work ahead of time to set those expectations.
Okay, many thanks. And another question that's come through. What is the panel's view on co-location of military, civil, commercial space capabilities on the ground? Is it necessary?
Depends on the definition and characteristic of necessary. Is it valuable and appropriate and the best course of action to take in some instances? Absolutely. There are a bunch of considerations. It could come down to the geographic location you need to provide access from, what facilities are available there for you in a defence versus what's already established in the commercial world. What are the skill sets that you're bringing into that work environment? Some of those will be military uniform, that minimum viable capability of owned capability. Some of them will be contracted and commercial services. So necessary. I think it would be difficult to avoid it, but I'd actually sort of turn the question around and say it's a really good thing to do, especially if you want to have that diversified and resilient network to give you the coverage where you need it, when you need it.
General Tedman, would you agree?
I think I would, actually, on balance. If you could, you would. I think that General Saltzman mentioned this. I would suggest that about 70 to 80% of the capabilities that we provide to the joint force are dual use. What we describe as ISR is another person's Earth observation sensor. And so there's lots of synergy there between those capabilities going forward. What we need to harness, I think, in defence, and I speak for the UK here, but I'm sure it's the same in other countries, is the innovation that's out there in the commercial sector and those bright people that are driving forward things like quantum, AI, cyber, dynamic space operations. They're the things that I'm personally interested in, and they're going to be ahead of the military, dare I say it, in the thinking of this. So the closer we can get to the people that are doing that thinking to inform where we go in the future can only be a good thing.
Okay, many thanks. And Paul Tedman, of course, has just said he's only been a month in the job, taking over, of course, from Air Marshal Godfrey. And there's a question that's come through on this specifically about the announcement of Air Marshal Godfrey joining your staff in the Pentagon. How will you leverage this post to turn grand strategy into attack and defend together as allies?
Well, he was holding a sign that said he would think and do staff work for food. I thought, well, kind of important to help out. I think the concept of being integrated by design, to recognizing that the Space Force is going to be wholly reliant on how well we build partnerships, whether it's the commercial industry, whether it's academia, whether it's the science and technology community, certainly whether it's our allies and international partners. Being integrated by design is fundamental to how I see the success of the Space Force. What I also recognize is that we were cut out of whole cloth of the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force. We pulled in some of the other services. We are a product of the Department of Defense, and that inherently gives us some blind spots, inherently. I come at everything from a U.S. perspective. Regardless of how many of these conferences I attend, regardless of how many conferences and bilats and trilats we have, I still have a U.S. perspective. And in the end, that can be limiting. And so every chance I get to embed a different set of perspectives into our decision-making processes, I think it adds value. Goddard's, we'll see. But, in general, the concept being, I kid, I'm lucky to have him. The concept is, as we want to integrate, if I go to outbriefs of exercises, if I attend a conference and have some discussions on the margin, it enhances my perspective. But if I have an officer on our senior staff that's day in and day out hearing the debates, hearing the resource trades, hearing the frictions, then we can routinely have that input. I think it's going to help us build a better integrated by design set of capabilities.
Greg, Novak, are you going to deploy the same strategy?
Well, what I was going to say was...
Paul.
No, I don't need to do that, but I won't roast him because he outranks me. But I will I will offer an ally's perspective on that, a partner's perspective on that as well, is the benefit is mutual. So we have a number of exchanges with allies and partners in the space domain, a large number of them with the US. we send the people over that we think can contribute best and meet the requirement of the position as it's described. But equally, managing where those individuals come back to in our own organisation once they've done that posting is really important for us. When we talk about access to niche technologies, when we talk about scale of operations, as the boss just mentioned, when we talk about perspectives and understanding what our allies and partners are thinking, you can't get that any better way than by embedding and working with those partners for a 2 or 3 year period. And then it's a matter of challenges then on me as the force generator when that individual comes back. Where do we put them to get best bang for buck?
Okay, many thanks. So we have another question from Raymond Lee from Tyler's UK. What is the role of strategic deception in integrated deterrence in the space domain? Is it an underplayed capability, noting General Saltzman's reference to the need for unambiguity to achieve deterrence? Would you like to take that one?
Well, as I mentioned, things that are unobservable are hard to use as deterrent capability. And so it is the collection of observables by which all militaries draw their conclusions on what the adversary looks like or what the possibilities for an operation are. The thing about observables is it's both ground truth and things that maybe aren't true that can still be observables. And I think it's that whole spectrum of what you want an adversary to see and believe about your force that has to be taken into consideration. Some of that happens to be the array of your order of battle. Some of that may be ways that you intend to use your operational mix of forces. In other ways, you may have to consider, I want them to observe this even though I may not intend to use it, just to keep those options open. So it's about making sure that the array of observables is as broad as possible in meeting your objectives.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What can be done about adversaries using commercial capabilities for high-grade ISR, as Russia is believed to have done in Ukraine? Anybody got an answer for that one?
Anybody got an answer for that?
But is that, to what extent is that on your radar? It's just another aspect that you are looking at and considering?
Sure. I mean, we're going to have to make sure that we're drawing as many broad conclusions as possible, but this is still unfolding, as was mentioned. So these are lessons observed. We need to take them to heart. We need to start getting into our war games and update our models and simulation and make sure we're accounting for the broadest possible set of circumstances that we could face. That's our job as military members, as military planners, is to kind of always look at a worst case scenario, always look at the contingencies and have the systems that support us so that when a decision maker asks us our opinion, we're not making it up on the fly. We've actually got data and experience and conclusions that we can draw based on that experience.
And you're talking about worst case scenarios. Another question which came in quite early. When or could space deterrence escalate to nuclear exchange? I mean, I imagine that is also on your radar. To what extent, 1 month into the job, Paul, what is what are you putting forward in terms of within your space operational capability and reaction to that?
So one of the things I think it's worth highlighting is I think we need to normalise space to a degree. It's just another military domain. It's also an AOR, and it's a capability, but it's no different to air in many respects, or the maritime or land environment. So when we're talking about a political response to a threat or an activity or action, there's a whole range of capabilities that can be brought to bear to deter and respond to that threat. And of course, at the extreme end, nuclear is one of them. To single out space, I think, is a little bit unhelpful as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned earlier, Greg, the fact that obviously Australia is a great domain for space activity. How do you really see the private exploration of space conflicting with military or sovereignty objectives, given there is so much interest in this domain?
I think that's the crux of that contested and congested environment we're in. Mm-hmm. The barriers to entry that for decades sort of saw spacefaring nations and government organisations leading the way, that's been turned on its head now. So I think, talked about knowing the domain before, we talked about a concept of operations, understanding that the commercial sector is a player in space, a big player in space, and you can't just ignore it, you can't assume it away, you have to plan for the environment you're presented. I think great ties with industry is one of the ways you can get after that, and we work very hard as do our allies and partners to make sure that our military objectives will align wherever we can with commercial objectives of our partners. And again, if there's recognition of the fact that some competitors will be employing dual-use capabilities just like we are, understanding where those are, and making sure that if there's any move towards what might be a reckless use of behaviour in space, that we would call that out. And leverage all the like-mindeds who will be equally affected by that to do the same.
Okay, thank you. And Paul, question for you. How does the UK get resilience in terms of space? Is the focus sovereign capability complementing the US or something else?
It's a great question. So we use this framework called Own, Access, Collaborate. So you'd intuitively understand that. So the own is the capabilities that we feel must be assured as a sovereign nation to deliver the things that we owe to the government to secure our national security. So they're the highly assured capabilities. The access is through the commercial sector. That could be all sorts of capabilities that have been described, including ISR, to name but one. And then there's the collaboration, which is with allies and partners, and indeed with industry, to get after some of those capabilities that are mutually beneficial for us to overlap and work together on orbit. So I think that framework serves us really well as we design our architecture going forward.
Okay, thank you. A question on behaving responsibly or irresponsibly. So how do we ensure that the consequences for behaving irresponsibly in space outweigh the benefits? Who would impose them and what could they be? I imagine this is all still being thrashed out. I mean, just given the fact that even over the last few conferences, space clearly is taking much more of a centre stage. So issues like this still need to be thought through, General.
Absolutely. And, I think what we're highlighting is that space is uniquely global in the sense that you can't just look at that part of outer space that extends above the British Isles. Like, that's not sufficient. If we could say, hey, it's safe above us, we're good to go. That's not the way space works. Threats on the other side of the world, threats in multiple orbits, threats out in cislunar closer to the moon can affect everybody on the planet. And understanding that globalized effect forces us to realize that, hey, it's irresponsible behavior, and any irresponsible behavior could affect all of us. That causes a joining of like-minded nations to really hold to account those agents that might choose to not behave responsibly. I think it's a series of international rule of order, right? You define what's acceptable, and then you build the capabilities to be able to find and attribute irresponsible behavior, and you apply the pressures like you do in other domains and other global commons. It's very hard in our international order to hold people accountable for things you think is irresponsible, short of conflict, crisis, and war. And so there's going to be a lot of diplomatic discussion here. There'll be a lot of agreements. I'm a firm believer that the larger the group of like-minded nations is, the more pressure that can be applied to nations who choose to act outside the interest of those nations. And so it really becomes peer pressure. But if we don't even have the ability to see and attribute bad behavior, it's not even a starting position. Or if it's a fait accompli and we're looking at it after the fact, it changes our bargaining space. So we have to build these capabilities to see what's going on and attribute that bad behavior, avoid that operational surprise before it happens.
Okay, many thanks. Now, we are coming to the end of this session. I do want to just have a quick scan to see if anybody on the floor wants to ask a question. Yes, we have one question just at the front here. Thank you.
Hi there, Tim Robinson, Aerospace magazine. Question to the panel: Do you think it's easier to escalate in space, given the bloodless aspect of it? If it's satellite v satellite, no one's dying there, or do you think it's more difficult in the potential, if you go to kinetic action, for that to kind of rebound on you and you end up destroying your own infrastructure through space debris and the runaway Kessler syndrome?
If I could real quick, if you just think about the space domain, I think you could make a case that it is easier because it is bloodless. There may not be loss of life that you would see if you were escalating in the other domains. But I can tell you, at least from a U.S. perspective, when we are talking about military operations and escalation, we never think about it as a single domain. You can't think about it as a single domain. Escalation in any domain could be escalation in all domains, to include the nuclear realm. And so in that sense, that collective understanding of what it means to escalate, I think still can constrain behavior in any one domain.
Okay, many thanks. And then just one last question that we have at the top. We touched on AUKUS in the last session, but given the panel construct, are there specific ambitions to leverage AUKUS to enhance collective space capabilities and information sharing? Greg Novak.
I think, yes is the short answer, that's why it's there, I think. And AUKUS as well, any framework we have that facilitates or makes it more readily available to share information, share technology, combine our operations, collaborate in our capability development is a really good thing. AUKUS gives us opportunities to do that, whether it's spaces specifically called out in the pillars or not. And it's important to note as well that AUKUS draws a lot of attention because of the Pillar 1 submarine piece, but it's just one of many frameworks that we leverage as allies and partners, and they have memberships that vary depending on the forum. The CSPO is one, OOD is another we've heard mentioned through the course of the day. So that's where I think AUKUS sits from my perspective. I don't know if there's other views.
Okay.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's it. And that last person who commented also just wanted to point out that he has a much cooler uniform than you do. And when are you going to get one the same?
Was that an Air Force officer said that?
We're just here to lower the IQ. the army
Character and
officers.
colour, that's what you get.
We're taking applications for all senior officers from other...
Well, please do give the panel a big round of applause, and thank you very much for your interaction. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.